Anyway, without further ado, I will step aside, and I'm glad you're here, and we're very excited for the programming for this weekend. So thank you very much, and enjoy the summit.
Justin Logan is the Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He is an expert on U.S. grand strategy, international relations theory, and American foreign policy. His current research focuses on 3 subjects: the failure of U.S. efforts at burden sharing in NATO, the shifting balance of power in Asia, and the limited relevance of the Middle East to U.S. national security. Leslie Vinjamuri is the President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She previously served as the director of the U.S. and the Americas program at Chatham House in London and has held fellowships at Harvard University and the London School of Economics. And finally, Robert Pape is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. His books include Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. This panel will be moderated by Eduardo Ribeiro, the Chief Financial Officer of the Chicago Thinker, who is a second year studying business economics and political science in the college. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Angron, for a beautiful introduction. So I'm Eduardo. I'm a second year in the college. And for this panel, I want to get right straight to it. Let's talk about Iran, right? We have a lot to talk about of last year in foreign policy. You have Venezuela, you have Europe, you have everything. But start with Iran. It's been in the headlines for the last month. So I wanted to ask, Professor Pape, recently you've argued on social media, and I'm taking your class, so you've argued 1,000 times in class, that the war in Iran, which we're engaged right now, it's a major blunder. It's going to backfire for the next few years for America. And you've also argued that it's going to be Iran is turning into a fourth center of world power. So can you explain what you mean by that, and we'll start off with it.
Thanks very much, Eduardo. It's a real honor to be here. One of the big reasons here is because I know all of these people very well. I've known Leslie since when she was in England, but I've known these two here from the University of Chicago. And this is really an event for young people. Well, someday this will be you. Okay? And so you should just count on that. These are now very important people, and it's really just an honor to be here.
I thought you were going to say old.
No, important.
Set higher goals.
So I'm going to talk for maybe 5 minutes. I want to put this in the context, the Iran war, of a value. And that value is primacy. I don't think we know much what that's about, what the taproot is, but that's an important value. I like the United States being the most powerful and richest country in the world. Now, I'll say more about what that taproot is in a minute, but what that taproot is not is forever wars. Forever wars, and you're familiar with Iraq, Afghanistan. Well, most of the young people think about this as 20 years. They weren't really there. I'm going to use another word for forever wars: waste. Waste. And that's not just 6,600 dead Americans, more than double who died on 9/11, but the $5 trillion plus we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan. Imagine if you had taken even half of that $5 trillion and invested it in the Rust Belt in America. Think about that. I'm talking about Western Pennsylvania through Kentucky, all the way through Detroit. Think about the world we would be in. That's what I mean by waste. Now, Iran is on the verge of becoming the next forever war. And by the way, we had a forever war before those two. It was called Vietnam. So we're now almost on our fourth forever war. And it's not like we have them every 10 years, but we've been having a lot of forever wars. And I have called this an escalation trap in Iran. That's my phrase. It's because just like in Vietnam, just like in the two forever wars, there were some good reasons to go in. It wasn't there was zero good reasons to go in. It's that every time we had a tactical success, that often led to a strategic failure where we doubled down and had escalation. Not always the same detailed form of escalation, but that's how they became forever wars. Now, So what do we need to do to get out of perennial, forever wars? I believe we need to understand what primacy really is. Now, in my business, a lot of people tell you primacy is, well, you got to figure out which part of the world is the most important, and then you got to figure out what means is most important, and it's an army. Well, I got to tell you that in World War II, if army size was the key to American primacy, we would never have demobilized in World War II. We would never have demobilized. And you know who did not demobilize? The Soviet Union. And look what happened to the Soviet Union. I believe primacy has not been well understood, and the taproot of American primacy is economic modernization. What has made us the richest, most powerful country since 1880? We have been the leaders in the electric revolution, the aluminum revolution, the aerospace revolution, the computer, and then the microelectronics revolution, and now the iPhone revolution. This is not destined. I don't think we have genes that are destined to make this true, but this is what's put at risk. And if we don't make that our number one goal, economic modernization, we're missing what is primacy. So we can say we want to have all these discussions of grand strategy, but we really need to understand what is job one. Now, okay, so if that's job one, how would that apply to the Middle East? Well, there is a strategy I like called offshore balancing, which means American military as the force of last resort. That is, don't fight other people's wars for them, but that's what we keep doing over and over and over again. So what would it mean to switch? What that would mean right now, today, you know, we have an economic blockade. We could start to switch. Who's hurt the most by that blockade? Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Are they have enough power to march on Tehran? No, they don't. Do they have enough power to use drones to shut down and do most of, maybe not all that we do in the naval blockade, but let's say 70% of what we do in the naval blockade? They sure do, certainly over a few months. So I think what we need to do is we need to recognize that we need a real offshore balancing plan here. We need to really develop it. And number one, that means shifting the burden to our ground allies, our regional allies, where they can do it. Number two, Netanyahu just laid out a key plan for getting us out of the demand pulls. There's two demand pulls pulling us in the Middle East, and we all know it. One is Israel. The other is oil and energy. So what would you do with Israel? Netanyahu on 60 Minutes said, 10-year plan, cut us off. He said, start now. I would start 10% a year, just take the plan. He's given the roadmap, put teeth in it though. 10% a year, every year for 10 years, you get to zero. This is what we should do. The third thing is, what are we gonna do about energy? There's a roadmap. It's called China. It's called solar. Okay, they're not doing it because they're Democratic Party people. This is not liberal progressives. They're doing it because it's primacy. We should be doing that. And I would adopt all this starting now. This may be hard for the Trump administration to swallow, but you folks are going to be here long after the Trump administration is gone. The president might not want to hear that, okay, but you're going to be here, and we've got to figure out, and you've got to figure out, what is an actual grand strategy for primacy? And I hope I helped. Thank you.
Perfect. So, here we go. So I wanted to pick up on something you said, and Leslie, if we can start with you, and if anyone wants to jump in. So you mentioned the major strategy, one of the major strategies the US should be doing is using its proxies in the Middle East. You pointed out at the UAE and in other countries that were affected by the embargo as options for that. How does the U.S. system of alliance has changed with that? Because we didn't see NATO countries helping us with the war. They, in fact, declined to do so. Do you think we could drag more countries in the Middle East into this war? And what does that mean for Americans' allies?
Yeah, big questions. I mean, I guess a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I don't don't disagree with the overall framing that, and one would never disagree with Professor Pape because he's so famous. But I don't disagree with the kind of tenets underneath the overall frame, that energy security is critical, that the United States, when it uses military force, should do so with a clear objective that is winnable given the resources that it has and the threat that it faces, rather than getting itself into wars in which it changes its objectives and ends up on the ground forever. And that there should be more reliance on ground allies for threats that are not primary to the United States. But I do actually take objection to the framing. And I think it's because I don't understand fundamentally why it's necessary to say, maybe it's because I lived outside the United States for 20 years. I'm married a Brit and have kids with 2 passports and all the rest of it. But, I don't understand why it's necessary for the United States to say, we must be number one. Why? Which isn't to say that, of course, the United States absolutely must invest in its infrastructure, in its education, in the people, including the dual nationals who live within our borders. Geography matters, that the economy must be strong, that we must be competitive. And one of the phenomenal sources of our competitiveness is that we're not actually nationalists. We're actually, within our home country, within our territory, we've been globalists at home. We've invited people in, and we've been wise enough to take advantage of their intelligence, their phenomenal drive and ambition, which often puts native-born U.S. white Americans to shame. And we've maybe held back a little bit on the us versus them. I think the us versus them, which is in a sense what the primacy framing does not actually strengthen the value, the purpose, the economy, the strength, the resilience, the likability, which translates into material impacts of the United States, either within or beyond its borders. The second point, it's a little bit, it's a little bit playing fast and loose with the facts to blame America's European allies for not helping this is not a response to you, it's a response to you.
I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying they didn't come in.
Well, they didn't come in. They weren't invited. They weren't told. They weren't informed. They weren't brought along. You want to bring your marital partner along, your students along, your boss along. You got to build, you got to make the argument, you got to build the coalition, you've got to show them why it's worth being your friend. And the United States has benefited massively from having allies, treaty allies, and also non-treaty allies, partners that China would give its right arm to destroy, undermine, or have, although that's not really been its strategy. So I don't think it's about, why aren't they there? Well, I mean, there are a lot of complicated reasons why they're not there, and it's still not really clear what the plan is. So, for countries that are small, struggling economically at home, have limited capabilities, and don't fundamentally trust the current U.S. leader, they're making a calculation that is, partly strategically or designed, and partly designed to respond to the fact that it's in the UK, 68% of Brits think that America is either primarily or largely doing bad for the world, bad things for the world. I mean, if that's your domestic political constraint, your decisions, if you frame it that way, your decisions look very differently. So, yes, of course, the U.S. needs to invest at home in order to be competitive abroad, but also the United States needs allies, needs partners, needs a strategy for the global South. And I don't think that it gets us very far to talk about how we need to be number one, we need to be primary, and we need to come first. It just it unnecessarily alienates the people on whose goodwill we need to depend.
Seth, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to come in on this. By the way, my most formative educational years were on this campus. So I got my master's and PhD here, worked with Bob You weren't on my committee, though, so you got here too late.
Yep.
But
I got to be impressed by you.
Love my time here and love being back. Really love being back. I always get energized by the intellectual energy here. I come at this from this sort of question from the U.S. Perspective. What, as the U.S. looks around the globe, as U.S. leaders look around the globe, what are the big threats that the U.S. needs to consider, both military and economic? From my perspective, when you look at the growing power, particularly of China economically, when you look at the growing military power of the Chinese, I was at Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa a couple of months ago, and we were going on a anti-submarine warfare mission flying out of a Navy P-8. There was a carrier strike group coming through the area and into the South China Sea, and in order to protect a carrier strike group, you obviously have not just the destroyers and the surface vessels and the submarines, U.S. submarines that are protecting it, but you also need aircraft to fly well ahead of where that aircraft carrier is going to go to drop sonobuoys to check for Chinese submarines lurking below the surface, which you can't see necessarily with satellite imagery. And it was a 2-hour trip from Kadena Air Force Base to the South China Sea, where we had our operations box to drop sonobuoys to look for the Chinese sub, which we found. What was striking is I sat up in the seat with the two pilots, and I've got the intelligence picture, and a P-8 up at the front's got an intelligence picture. And what was stunning was, because I read a lot of stuff, but what was stunning was actually to see the real-time picture of People's Liberation Army aircraft that were flying and surface vessels. This was not one of the joint sword exercises, though they've been doing a lot of those. This was just sort of routine operations. It looked like New York City or Chicago at rush hour, and just the sheer number of vessels. What the Chinese are doing when it comes to the use of military civil fusion to build 5th generation and now 6th generation strike aircraft, bombers that are highly capable, more missiles now than the United States on a yearly basis, including long-range strike. They're on pace for 1,000 nuclear warheads by the end of the decade, and 1,500 by the early 2030s. Ground systems, their shipbuilding capacity is over 230 times the size of the U.S.'s both commercial and military shipbuilding capacity. Let me say that one more time. 230 times the size of U.S. shipbuilding capacity. One of China's shipyards is larger than all U.S. shipyards combined.
What's even scary about it, that it's every commercial ship in China has to be fitted with military standards, which means that every carrier, every passenger carrier can be turned into a military carrier or like something to carry on tanks. So if we go into war, that's absolutely true. They have 230 more.
Yeah.
Capacity to build,
from my perspective, this is the country to be focused on. Mm-hmm. So the concern I have with Iran is we continue to focus foreign policy energy, and I'll come back to it later. I won't bore the details now. Expend massive numbers of munitions that have depleted our entire stockpile below the war plans we have for any of our combatant commands are called operational plans or O plans. We're below the level requirement for our China O plan right now for both some defensive and offensive munitions. My question is, was that the strategic calculation that we wanted to take? Does that make sense? We've got a major competitor in the Chinese, and we have just expended vast resources the Iranian threat is not insignificant, but my general view is the Israelis are actually able to take care of most of that, as we saw getting air dominance in 2 days of that war, which is actually striking because it's worth noting the Russians in year 5 still don't have air dominance over Ukraine. So my big issue is if you're prioritizing your national security strategy and your defense strategy, this is not how you do it.
Justin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just say everything is exactly as it seems. Your crazy boomer uncle is just pushing buttons and doing things. The Congress is an irrelevancy. The sort of foreign policy commentariat is an irrelevancy. And I think, I want to very much associate myself with Dr. Jones's remarks about, if you wanted to prioritize, this wasn't how you would do it. We're absolutely not prioritizing. We're moving air defenses out of the Indo-Pacific into the Middle East. And I'll just say, as a sort of global statement, I wrote a paper a long time ago that had this wisecrack that I'll share with you. I'm sorry. The Middle East is a small, poor, weak region whose problems we cannot fix. And the best thing we could do would be to leave it alone. But we seem to be incapable of doing that for reasons that are entirely inscrutable to me as somebody who's been around this business for the better part of 20 years. The president did not make a case in Washington, D.C. for why there was a proximate threat posed by Iran. They were bragging last June about having, quote, totally obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. After launching this latest war, the president announced that they were 2 weeks from a nuclear weapon. There's a technical IR term for this. It's called lying. He's lying about how close the Iranians were to a nuclear weapon. And I think we in this sort of foreign policy commentariat, if we do think, and I'm a fairly dovish guy generally, but I do think that big, powerful, wealthy states, if you're going to have a military or what your military should be pointed at, we should have our hair on fire about the extent to which the ingredients for conducting the American way of war are being drawn down by insane, idiotic, counterproductive conflicts in the Middle East. After the 12-day war in June, the Pentagon leaked to the Guardian newspaper that we had 25% of the interceptors needed to sort of instantiate existing defense plans globally, right? The American way of war involves insulating ourselves to a very high degree from retaliation from the adversaries and insulating our partners and regional allies from retaliation for the adversaries. There is going to be more news coming out in the coming days and hours about the extent to which we have drawn down munitions that are essential for conducting any American military operation against any country larger and more powerful than Venezuela. So I think this is we've crossed a Rubicon here where these supplies are not replenishable in short order. We are just doing something that's insanely counterproductive. And I would just say as sort of two coda to 2 points that were made previously, I very much agree with Professor Pape's remarks about economic innovation and our wealth being the sort of taproot of our strength. But that economic growth, that wealth, is a taproot of our uniquely wonderful geography, right? If you look at what the founding fathers said about the United States of America, the last thing they wanted to do was to get swept up in the intrigue and power politics of continental Europe. And now we seem to be swept up in the intrigue and power politics of literally every region on the face of planet Earth. This is anathema to the principles that founded this country. And just as one coda to my other coda, when it comes to allies, right, we hear about the force multipliers that our allies are. We have a fundamental formal treaty commitment to 1/4 of the countries on planet Earth. Right? And in many ways, they are important partners of ours. But in each and every case, the ally needs the United States more than the United States needs the ally. And we would do well to keep that in the front of our brains.
Mm-hmm. So what's your best guess to why we're in Iran? 3 words.
The president decided. It's 4, sorry. Oh, it's great. Yeah.
It's pretty good. So something pretty much everybody touched on is our industrial capability is not up to par with the Chinese. And we're wasting basically everything we have with Iran. And Professor Pape talked about it in class. Seth, that's a big part of your research. How do we fix that in 5 to 10 years? Is there any way we can get started?
So as Eduardo knows, and I just presented, so last June I spent 2 weeks in China visiting touring their advanced industries. So I've been to China many times. My first trip was 1979, and I was with 30 economists visiting the industries then. So I went back multiple times in between, but this was a trip just to look at the shop floors, and not just in Beijing. So I went to the electric vehicle manufacturer Xiaomi, that's in Beijing, also BYD, that's in Shenzhen. Wuhan, which is kind of like their Pittsburgh, it was an old steel. Now it is laser lathing and so forth, and also Alibaba and Hangzhou. The big deal, folks, is we're missing 90% of this. My Substack, called the Professor Pape Substack, you're going to get a ton of this, all with the
Ever had the
pictures.
bingo in there? You can
Yeah,
write it down.
all with this coming here, because this is different than the escalation part of the Iran war, because this is what we're missing. China is not just investing in a company like Xiaomi. They're uplifting whole cities, multiple interlinked sectors, and not just interlinked sectors of DeepSeek and Alibaba, healthcare, motor vehicle, where you go to get your driver's license.
So how do we replicate that?
The
model?
number one thing we've got to do, and this is, I think, the discussion here, is I think people don't really want to defend what is primacy and what's the source of our primacy. Why is it we have to take on China? Why can't we have a massive program to help Taiwan with drones? I've been to Taiwan many times, and yes, it's all true what Seth said. It's also true that we're going to have a hard time putting our carriers anywhere near this, and as China's missiles get longer, this just is never going to work. What we need to think about here is what is primacy, what's the taproot, and why at each step is this exactly advancing primacy? And I think we're just not having that conversation. We're having conversation, they've got more widgets than we do. I just don't think this is right. And also, Leslie, it's enlightened primacy in my view. So you're right, but think of it as like the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment understood self-interest, if too narrow, is self-defeating. With allies, I think there's lots of room for cooperating with allies here. I don't buy the idea that we're Uncle Sucker. I think we've suckered them. There's a whole story that Eduardo knows on that. But the bottom line is we're not talking about what is primacy. And I think that's the key.
What
Go
is
for it.
primacy? What is primacy, sir?
Primacy is what do you need to keep America the wealthiest country on the planet? Why? What is that really going to take? And if you say to Americans, that's okay, we're going to become like Britain and we're just going to descend and we'll become like number 5 and then number 12. Yeah. Well, let's see if Americans are up for this. And the reason, Leslie, you got to do this is I don't buy for a second Americans are going to vote for that. I just think this has to be something that and we don't ever really talk about this. And not our presidential candidates. They assert things in hints and flashes. I'm calling for an actual conversation about what's making for primacy and why is it $5 trillion wasted in Iraq and Afghanistan, at least in 18 of the 20-year wars. Why was that really worth it? Let's have that conversation. I don't think they can defend it.
So Leslie, Seth, Justin, well, I guess the four of you, and I would agree too, no Americans benefiting from the war, directly or indirectly. How do we deal with primacy given that situation? Now that you know what primacy means.
I mean, okay, so first of all, I still think, and it's not because I reject the premise, but I still think you haven't explained why it's important to be wealthiest. Is it because, I mean, I don't mean that as a simplistic question. Mm-hmm. Is it because if we aren't ahead, we will fall behind and we won't be able to distribute the benefits of that wealth to our people? Is it because if China's wealthier than we are, they will seek to reduce our autonomy? Like, what is it? I actually think it's important to say why it's important to be wealthiest. Because I think if you don't make that case, it just kind of reads like the guy on the football field in high school who was slightly, you've got to say why it matters in order to make a compelling case. In terms of, how do we get to a different point? I mean, let's call a spade a spade. We need different political leadership in the country. And because we need a leader who will unite the country in a way that makes it possible to invest our energy in productive things rather than counterproductive things. And that's not a partisan statement. That's a statement about leadership. Leadership shouldn't be about partisanship. So we do need a change of leadership. And because we can't actually make the investments and compete when we're sort of, arguing with ourselves in ways that are fundamentally destructive and not bringing Congress and all the rest of it along in order to make investments, adopt the right set of policies that would allow us to make the capital investments and be competitive in the way that the others are suggesting we need to.
Yeah. Seth and Justin, does it matter that we're number one or not? And if so, how do we get there?
Look, I think it is important for the U.S. to be, and I think from a selfish perspective, I think most countries would want this too, but I think that it is important for the U.S. to be economically competitive. I just want to add the defense component because at the end of the day, the U.S. needs to defend itself, its homeland. And there may be periods if, let's say, there are key choke points in the Pacific that an expansionist China were to take. We'd have to think about what strategies, in cooperation with our Japanese and or Australian and South Korean allies, what steps we would take. My worry on the defense side is that we are not prepared even for a protracted conflict. We are in year 5 in Russia right now, and I think it's very hard to deter. That if you want to deter, it's very hard to deter if you've got munition stockpiles that won't get you past 1 week of a conflict with China. Our LRAS, long-range anti-ship missile stockpile, is about 1 week right now. Our precision, our JASSM and Tomahawks now 3 weeks. We just did a game last week. We ran out of Tomahawks in 3 weeks.
Really?
That for me is a problem because if the U.S. needs to project power and to protect itself, I don't think we have the capability to do that for a protracted war, particularly against a major power. So I'm not saying we go out and fight countries per se. Bob, I actually agree with you on the Afghan and Iraq war.
Getting closer.
Yeah, but I think the last book I wrote, which came out a couple of months ago, looks at the history of the U.S. defense industry and the rise and fall of the defense industrial bases of the great powers over the last century. And one of the things that that's really interesting is the U.S. did not have an industrial base essentially up to World War II. We essentially, even after World War I, we essentially took our companies, most of our companies which are commercial, and went back largely to producing commercial systems. What we were able to do during World War II was absolutely stunning in a way. I mean, and this was Roosevelt, Democratic president, seeing what was going on well before Pearl Harbor. There are a number of things that I would take as very interesting lessons for today. So what did he do? One was focus on maximizing production for protracted conflict. For the idea of strengthening deterrence first and foremost. So how do you do that? So what you need to start becoming a country that produces things. If you look at our production capacity, even on the military sphere, we struggle. We saw that in Ukraine. We struggled with Javelin. We struggled with Stinger. We struggled with 155 millimeter rounds. We couldn't provide Ukraine. We weren't fighting there, but we couldn't even provide it. Our industrial base is on a peacetime footing. Second is we have acquisitions and contracting systems that are fast. We are anything but that right now. Our commercial sector moves quickly. If you look at the algorithm and the 5 commandments of Elon Musk, take Elon Musk, like him or hate him, His business practices at Tesla and at SpaceX are absolutely phenomenal. SpaceX is a phenomenal company in streamlining acquisitions and contracting. Our defense procurement process is literally broken right now. There have been some efforts to improve it, so I would do that second. Third is we've got gross supply chain weaknesses right now. We rely largely on our biggest competitor, China, for critical minerals, including the production of those critical minerals and rare earth minerals. So, I think there are some major steps we need to take on finding alternative sources for that. And then just the last thing is the workforce. Our workforce, if you visit any of our shipyards or industrial production line, we are largely operating as a 19th century country on many of our production lines. Probably less so on the aerospace, but shipyards, like 18th century if you visit Bath Iron Works or down in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I mean, I've been to all these shipyards. And you go then visit the Koreans and the Japanese, which have automation and robotics, and we don't have much of that at any of our shipyards. So for me, there's a workforce issue that involves education. And I want to go, I think it was you who mentioned that earlier, Bob. I can't remember. Somebody mentioned this comment about education and college. College is not for everybody. It was for me. It may be for all of you, but we have trade schools. We have vocational schools. That has been a history and a strength of our industrial base. And we have not. I mean, it's if you go to the Arsenal of Democracy speech by Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, he was actually speaking to the workforce of the United States. So just to summarize, as I've looked at the last 100 years, there's a focus on production. There's an important component of acquisition and contracting, supply chains, and workforce that I think are critical to becoming a defense industrial and an industrial-based power. And we are not that. If you visit Chinese facilities, they are certainly moving in that direction with their military-civil fusion concept. So for me, it is a complete rejuvenation of the industrial base that I think is badly missing right now. Yeah.
So, Justin, you want to jump in?
Oh, go ahead. Let's keep chugging.
Great. So I wanted to ask a question because I think President Trump got elected largely. One of the things was talking about Ukraine and how we're wasting money in Ukraine and wasting resources in Ukraine. And now we're doing that in Iran. And all the four of you seem to agree that Iran is a waste of resources and a waste of time. But not all four of you think that Ukraine was a waste of resources and a waste of time. What's the strategic difference, and what's the weapon, the manufacturing capacity difference, or what's the difference between the two of them? Justin, you want to start?
Well, I'll mount up on my trusty steed again.
Yeah.
The geography is the difference, right? The geography of the border between Russia and Ukraine is really bad for defense. The secular, economic, demographic, and political realities of Russia and Ukraine are really bad for the defense. Ukraine has overperformed what I thought and said in February of 2022. That's wonderful. But very similar to the way that I would argue the victories that we could have won. Maybe this is rolling a grenade with the pin out onto Dr. Jones's chair. But I think we basically achieved what we could have achieved in Afghanistan by the beginning of 2002. And all the money that we frittered away over there after that was a complete waste. I think Ukraine holding Kyiv, not letting this cockamamie concept of operations that Putin had, that he'd be greeted as liberators. Are we going to do greeted as liberators? Do these people not listen to each other? Right? George Bush did that in Iraq. We were not greeted as liberators. But so they basically held the line. They outperformed what most people thought they could do. But now this idea that we've been chasing, I mean, our colleagues in the sort of defense establishment talk about Russian defeat, Ukrainian victory. I've never once heard either of those terms defined. We're simply throwing money at a problem that we haven't defined. And again, I totally want to associate myself with Dr. Jones's remarks on the struggles and the sort of sclerotic nature of the U.S. defense industrial base. And think about what we say and think about what we do. What we said about Ukraine was that the future of world order rises or falls on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Is the behavior that we undertook in defense production suggestive that we actually believed what we said? We did in World War II. An incredible revolution in the way that we produced weaponry. We didn't do that here. So were we lying, or were we sort of like a Mansur-Olson sclerotic state that's incapable of shifting in short order? I think it may have been a combination of both. But the basic story about Ukraine was that the survival of a sovereign, autonomous Ukrainian state that was still subject to Russian bullying was about the best outcome you could achieve, and that outcome was achieved in fairly short order, sadly, and that was about as best as we could do.
Does anyone want to jump in on the Ukraine-Iran comparison?
Well, let me say a word about why, if we understand primacy correctly, this helps us with the Ukraine debate. So I believe that American primacy since 1990, we were 26% of the world's GDP in 1990. Today, we're 26% of the world's GDP. If you look at Germany, they've fallen as a world percent of GDP, 40%. Britain, 40%. France, 40%. Italy, 40%. Japan, 60%. So in that 30-year period, who's been the sucker here? I say not Uncle Sucker. I say that it's been a good thing for us to have stability in Europe, mostly stability in Europe. And I think that that's because we have mostly a decent economy. It doesn't, I'll answer your question also, I hope, in a second. But it's not, but what we have gained here is tremendous because we didn't fall by 40% of the world's GDP. So I think, first of all, we need to understand we have had a benefit with Europe. The second thing to understand, what does that mean, though, with Ukraine? Stability. Does that mean rolling Ukraine into Moscow? I say absolutely not. Does that mean giving Ukraine the ability to have drones? I say absolutely. Why? Because that's mostly being funded right here in Chicago by Jennifer Pritzker. This has mostly been a basically donor-driven problem because they're not trying to do HIMARS. What's happening is we went down this road of the military-industrial complex. And I also think that Seth, I actually love his book. I think he's right. I don't see us disagreeing. I see us as trying to understand how to solve those problems here. And I just want to put the focus on primacy. What makes us number one? And why be the most wealthy? Because Americans want the American dream. They don't want the top 1% to be wealthy. They want the American dream. That's why people are coming to America. That's why they stayed in America. And if we don't have the American dream anymore, I don't know what's going to happen to America, but it's not good.
I've never actually heard the American dream defined in terms of being richer than the Chinese. I've always heard it defined as being free to choose to be wealthy.
No, I'm doing it the way Raj Chetty does, which is, can you get ahead compared to your parents? Can you keep getting ahead over time?
How do you do that if we're blowing
it's growth
in
internally.
the military?
I want to say one additional thing, because I agree with much of what's been said on Iran versus Ukraine, but the Ukraine, they're not the same wars, right? Iran had, go way back, been complying with the JCPOA, so we're told, by those who went and inspected. And yes, of course, lots of regional adventurism and all the rest of it, but that had, over the course of the last few years, been diminished in part by Israel's activities. But the Ukraine problem was that Russia invaded Ukraine, right? It was a violation of the sovereignty of an independent, autonomous European state, which is not what happened with Iran. With Iran, Israel and the United States decided to bomb the country and kill the leader. I mean, they're not the same equations, so we should be careful not to just sort of lump them in there together. And I think the problem has been very well articulated by the others, that the United States sort of asserted one objective, but actually it was, driven by this logic of not, giving them just enough so that they couldn't win, and with the logic being that they wanted to avoid an escalation that would bring NATO into a direct confrontation with Russia. But it was, always deeply flawed as a strategy. But the reason for going, I think, was for defending Ukraine was initially right. That, it's not actually a great thing to just turn a blind eye when one power rolls over the territory of another power, especially in Europe.
Seth?
Yeah, so 3 points here. The first is that I think prioritizing again, for me, I said China is the one to be particularly concerned about. How you act and what you do, we can debate. I would put second, they're not a great power anymore, but I would put the Russians second. They have nuclear weapons. They've got a large mobilizable force. They have, when you look at quantitative capabilities, reasonable capabilities, and a strong relationship with the Chinese. Same country we're talking about.
Which has gotten stronger since we pushed them into the arms of the Chinese.
And, interesting, by the way, after President Trump leaves China, who is coming to Beijing, it, of course, is Vladimir Putin. They've had over 50 meetings now. So for me, prioritization, concerned about the Russians. Second issue is the Russians are incredibly vulnerable in Ukraine. So we have, I'm going to call them an adversary. They're incredibly vulnerable. Look at the way they've performed over the last 4+ years. They're now honing in on 1.5 million casualties. Their average rate of advance is slower now than the Battle of the Somme during World War I. That's how slowly they're moving. The Ukrainians actually took more territory than the Russians in the month of February this year, mostly in the Sumy area. And so, the Russians have struggled. So we've got, for me, priority number 2 that is struggling. And so if the decision that the U.S. makes, unlike the Iranian case, is we're going to risk how many soldiers? 0. We have lost how many soldiers in Ukraine? 0, unlike the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. And actually, in weapons exports now, the Europeans, as you may know, are buying American arms and then giving them to the Ukrainians now. It's actually a net gain in some ways, and the fighting and the dying is being done by the Ukrainians, and they are performing incredibly well. I've been to Ukraine several times, been up near the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so for me, prioritization, definitely concerned about the Russians. They are struggling mightily. And for me, the costs, financial and military costs, are actually quite low. So I'll take that bet.
I totally disagree that the military costs were quite low. We're not losing people. But those drawdowns of interceptors, those drawdowns of so many different platforms didn't start on October 8th, 2023. They started in February 23rd, 2022. The Ukraine war has been an immense suck of resources on, again, the elements that are essential to the American way of war, including in the Indo-Pacific. So if we're going to talk about prioritization, we need to loop in, even though, thank God, we haven't had U.S. casualties in large numbers in Ukraine, the drawdowns. I think there's something really important about the conflict in Ukraine that my colleagues in sort of Washington talk about, right? Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. It's a big country. It has a lot of people. It bullies foreign countries. It has a high appetite for risk. But it's kind of sort of losing in Ukraine. Russia can either be an important sort of hegemonic or quasi-hegemonic threat in Europe. It can be losing in Ukraine, but it can't be both. If Russia is floundering in Ukraine, it is not a threat to the core interest in Europe, which is keeping European power divided. We didn't want, in World War I, we didn't want Kaiser Wilhelm to dominate Europe. In World War II, we didn't want Adolf Hitler to dominate Europe. And in the Cold War, we didn't want Joseph Stalin to dominate Europe. Vladimir Putin's Russia is not any of those states. So I'm basically agreeing Russia is floundering in Ukraine. However, that's a good news story. It's a good news story that we should fob off on the Europeans, who are, again, revealing their own preferences by sort of slow walking in defense production and other things, which we've been terribly counterproductive on, because we're telling them out of one side of our mouth, we really want the European defense industrial base to spin up. And out of the other side of our mouth, we say, you better buy American or we're going to let you have it. So I think the sort of meta theme to this string of outrageous remarks is opportunity costs. And I would put opportunity costs, again, Professor Pape mentioned, we've benefited by keeping the peace in Europe. And I think unless you run the sort of Back to the Future John Mearsheimer 1994 play where you think, we're going to have like World War III erupt in Europe in the 1990s, which I don't, because there were French nuclear weapons, UK nuclear weapons. Germany was a sort of sclerotic, self-hating state at the time. It still kind of is sclerotic and self-hating. Unless you think that we were going to have World War III erupt there, then you have to account for all the US exertions. We spend about $100 billion a year in today's dollars defending Europe from itself. Run that play all the way back to the point where the US had many more troops in Europe. This is real money. And at the time, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, it was easy to say, we will have more guns and more butter forever. I have bad news. We're $40 trillion in debt. We're adding to that debt at the rate of $2 trillion a year. And guess what? The top three items in the federal budget, healthcare, Social Security, and interest on the debt, are basically not amenable to near-term policy resolutions. Guess what the fourth item is? The defense budget. So we have secular downward pressure on defense budgets. Hawks and doves alike say that we are basically insolvent, to use Walter Lippmann's phrase, right? What we're trying to achieve in the world is under-resourced to the tune of $1 trillion a year. The United States comprises about 40% of world military spending before the sort of sugar high plan for fiscal 2027. With our treaty allies, vaunted treaty allies, we comprise 2/3 of total world military spending. That's a lot. And we're talking about having to add another $500 billion a year. We have a strategy problem. We don't have a resource problem.
Well, I'm going to give you guys just a second to respond. We're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes, so prepare for that. So I'm going to give each of you guys about a minute to answer, and there you go. Pape.
So I just want to bring us back for a moment to Iran. So again, we have this big issue coming up. President Trump's back. Iran controls Hormuz. Today I was just on, I do this thing on UAE, and I was on with a diplomat in Iran. I didn't know I was coming on with Tehran, but I didn't get off, and it was really interesting. I see no sign they're giving up. For 45 minutes I was on with this guy. I see no sign they're giving up Hormuz, which means if we don't use US military ground pressure or air pressure, 3-4 years from now, is Iran giving up Hormuz? I don't think so. Maybe they'll cut us a bit of a break, but that's the future. And in 2 years from now, will they have a working nuclear weapon? Why not? Why not? So we do nothing, okay? That is, we just say, even keep the blockade. I think you can see future number one. Future number two is right now, ground or air pressure by the United States. I'm saying once we think about primacy, there's a third option, which is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, we hand over the issue of the blockade to them. And I think that's a better third strategy than anything I've heard. And if we have a third strategy, other than just, please give us back the deal, I mean, I just want to know what that really is. And I think that comes from correctly understanding primacy should be our number one goal.
Seth, you want a minute?
I think the problem. I think the problem with number three right now is that the Emiratis, the Saudis, Bahrainis, and the Omanis would disagree with you and say we don't want to go in there. So I think the problem you have
then
is,
let them get toppled, because that's what I'm telling them literally every day on Zooms. Is that here's your choice. What's going to happen when they become, after 3 or 4 years of Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi and Emirati GDP going down 30% over 4 years, and all that power growing, here is they're going to topple those governments. So I'm saying survival is why they should do it.
But there is also the political reality in the United States of gas prices, which are now headed to the mid-5s on the East Coast. And by the end of May, the CEO of one of the largest U.S. companies said it could be in the mid-6s.
So then you're on the military escalation ladder.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying I'm on the ladder of we shouldn't have done it in the first place.
Well, of course. Well, no, I think we all got that. Yeah.
Leslie, one of
I mean, this is such a depressing conversation on a Friday night at a sunny campus. But it's exactly right. Like, we are stuck in between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I assume that you'll sort of laugh at this idea that the British and the French, who are convening these 40 nations to try and come up with a plan for governing the Strait once there's a actual deal, if there is to ever be a deal between the U.S., Iran, and maybe Israel. I don't know if the 40.
Well, it doesn't do any harm, Leslie.
It doesn't do any harm,
but it's not going to stop the actual choices.
It's not, but maybe it can be a few others to give cover. But yeah, no, I guess I don't see any. I'm guessing here, but I don't see. I personally suspect that President Trump has no real interest in escalation right now, because he kind of probably knows what a mess he's in and that it could get worse. But God, the next person who has to inherit this problem. This is a U.S. leader who's created an extraordinary not to say that others haven't as well, but has, over the course of these 4 years, created a terrible inheritance problem for the next leader. Be careful what you wish for if you decide to run for president.
Awesome. Well, does anyone have any questions? Let's go to Arthur there.
We started to disagree, which is good, or among the panel.
Hey, can everyone hear me? I'm Arthur Hicks, fourth-year undergrads. I saw a piece of news that the welders at the Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, are paid around $17 an hour. So that's $34,000 a year pre-taxes. So I can imagine a situation where someone taps them on the shoulder and says, "Hey, just don't do your job as well as you could. Just make that ship a little bit weaker." And that would play into our adversary's hands. So how are we supposed to defend ourselves, and how are we supposed to have a national security strategy if the efficiency model leads us to just choke the workers who make our ships?
You guys want to respond?
I mean, look, this is a big challenge. Actually, the problem when you visit shipyards, take Groton, where we build our nuclear-powered submarines, our Virginia and Columbia class. The problem there is actually that people are getting hired at that wage level. People are getting hired by Costco or Walmart, and we have been down this road before. You got two options. One is, well, you may have more than that. One is there are at least two allies, South Korea and Japan, that build an extraordinary number of ships. So we actually do pay our aerospace workforce much better. So option number one is you essentially subcontract some of the. You're probably not going to want to do it with your aircraft carriers or your nuclear-powered submarines, just because of the sensitivities involved. One is you essentially subcontract that out to foreign allies that can actually do this. All of us have the ability to buy cars made in the United States that are built here, BMW in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The U.S. has just recently, as we all, I think, know, allowed the Hanwha to buy Philly Shipyard. So we do have now massive investment. TSMC, same thing in Arizona. So we have, with that foreign investment, one of the things that's been interesting about Philly is wages have gone up for work for the at the shipyard in Philadelphia. So this is make it a competitive market and allow foreign competition into our shipbuilding industry. That will start increase. And a second issue, which I would also like to see, is more government investment in this issue, both in terms of raising pay for our workforce, but also providing education to the workforce, so that the welder you're talking about most welders aren't going to go to college, but they will go to vocational or trade schools. We've made no investments along those lines. So I have a couple of things that I think are strong options. There's another shipyard that the Pentagon is discussing having a foreign shipyard company buy and then have the U.S. oversee. I think that has a huge value in starting to solve that problem.
Let's go to one more quick question, yeah. Marcos?
Thank you, and thank you for the panel. My name is Marcos. I'm a second year here in the college. Professor Pape, earlier you mentioned solar in China as this, the spectacular win for China's energy policy. I think if you look at the numbers, it's less than 10%, maybe even 5% of their real energy use, and most of it remains in coal, which we see as a little bit prehistoric today. And this whole conversation has been revolving around really like what energy use we have. It's Venezuela, it's Iran. And so I wonder, is this sort of letting go of Iran, letting go of the Strait of Hormuz, as Seth pointed out with the prices, right, of gas and what Americans are really facing, is that something that we can take a strategy and instead of just trusting the free open markets to decide what energy is the best to invest in?
Well, the big problem with trying to physically, militarily take back the Strait of Hormuz is we have no way to do that without eating a lot of casualties. Now, my work, I've been studying air power for 30 years. I've taught for the U.S. Air Force. Before the war, I wrote a piece where I predicted if we'd bombed, we'd kill leaders, ... but they would lash back, take Hormuz, and also then we'd be in a ground power dilemma. So that's been the case now for almost 12 weeks, where we're in this ground power dilemma. The problem with the ground power dilemma and why it's a dilemma is it's not just whether you take Karg or 2 square miles of beach near Hormuz. There is no solid ground power option. What that means is you might start then a ground war by having a massive air war, take out all the electric power, not because exactly you want to hurt everybody, but because you're trying to diminish all of the possible attacks against you. And having taught with the strategic bombers in the Air Force, John Warden, it sounds almost exactly like that's who's advising Trump. I mean, I spent years with them, day by day, every day for 3 years, arguing with them on this. And I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it will cause Iran to buckle. I don't think that it will significantly diminish the ground casualties. But the fact of the matter is that this is what Americans need to hear, that this is not, we don't know what will happen if we start down the military escalation road. Notice there's not a single historical example being given of an economic blockade bringing an enemy to its knees in just a couple of months or even years. And we had essentially an economic blockade on Saddam Hussein's oil for 12 solid years, bringing down that economy 47% a year for 12 years. Still, we had to go in with the ground war. And that then went to a forever war. So my point here is that, am I absolutely sure? So visiting the factories, they literally are showing me the plans where the advanced industries, not everybody in China, but the advanced industries, that 11% you're describing, happens to match almost exactly the portion of their economy that's in those advanced industries. Well, that's what we should be doing. We should be not going into solar because it's the liberal thing to do, because it saves the planet. We should be going into solar because we need fantastic amounts of electric power. And we've got to figure out how are we going to do that without jacking up the price of everybody's electric bill here. And that's why we have to talk about the wealth of our country. Because if we just simply don't, then what we're going to end up doing is we're not going to get there. But I certainly think the ground or the military options here, I think are going to be just stunningly horrendous once we go down those roads.
Can I add one comment? This was not well known. The president came 24 hours away from executing, because I know what the plans were, executing and I'm not saying this was going to be successful.
The Esfahan thing.
A solely air cover operation He had gotten insurance companies involved to buy in on it at the beginning of last week. And so the U.S. was going to provide A-10s, MQ-9s, and other fighter F-35s to essentially provide an air cover for ships, but not put destroyers through or cruisers through, because I don't think he wanted to see not put the Muse on the ground to take any islands, but just provide air cover. He pulled the plug right at the last minute because one of the French vessels got hit and decided it was not going to be successful. So that option did not work out.
And it's still there.
We have like 3 more minutes here. Can we get to one more question real quickly? Let's go here in the front. Yeah, go for it.
Well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Tanya. I'm a second year in the college.
That's fine.
Wait, you got to get they can't hear you online.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Tanya. I'm a second year in the college, and I had a question for Mr. Jones. You talked a lot about like how our shipbuilding capacity in the United States is just minuscule compared to that of China. And one of the big reasons like why the US won World War II is the fact that they were just able to out-manufacture like competitors. It's like the US had like barrages of ice cream for the soldiers in the Pacific while the Japanese were starving. So what do you think should be the future of the Jones Act in regards to like increasing like American shipbuilding capabilities?
I mean, I was just having a conversation with Senator Kelly about this last week. I think you kill it. I think the Jones Act has outlived its importance. It would actually free up competition in shipbuilding. You know, when you open up the hood of an F-35 aircraft, the supply chain is global. You've got parts from around the world. In fact, that same aircraft is built in Japan and also in Italy. Why are we shielding our entire shipbuilding from global competition? So Jones Act has been, for me, one of the worst implications of that. And even in the case like the Hanwha Philly shipyard, you actually have American workers. You've got some foreign workers there too, but you've got American workers. Now foreign-owned shipyard in the U.S. So I would get rid of the Jones Act, period.
Great. Well, let's do this. Give me 3 words for the next 5 years of American foreign policy. The best you can.
3 words?
3 or 5, something like that.
Fixing the damage.
China, China, China.
I'll give you 4. Stuck in escalation trap. In 5 years, we're not getting out.
Build, invest, transform.
Sounds great. Well, thank you guys for coming. This has been great. Thank you for the audience. And we'll have the next panel soon. Thank you so much.
Leslie, that's excellent.